Hey guys, welcome back. We've got a video here from Mark Felton. You guys have actually requested a lot of his videos. This one, it's Mark Felton Productions here on YouTube, and it is Britain's Vietnam War. So, the only thing that I can think of that this would be is like the same Vietnam War that we had in like what the 60s and 70s, because generally we kind of you guys always help us out, um and I guess usually vice versa, but I think that we tend to get into more stuff or join together to help other allies. I know that Vietnam, like, they used some wild tactics during Vietnam, at least against the US. I know that they are like hardcore, because that was like one of the worst wars as far as like. I think there was some warfare going on that the U.S. soldiers were not expecting when they got over there, right? So I'm thinking that it ties in with our Vietnam War, but I guess we will find out here shortly. I will link this video in the description along with links over to Patreon and how you can support the channel here on YouTube. All that is in the description for you, but let's go ahead and jump into it.
This video is sponsored by the Great Courses Plus, but more on that later. Long before most Americans had even heard of Vietnam, the British took on Ho Chi Minh's communists, the Viet Minh, and won. World history could have been very
well, you guys did better than we did, probably. So yeah, I don't know anything about this, so this should be interesting.
different if the British had fully succeeded, and the later Vietnam War would probably never have happened. In 1945, Vietnam was, along with Cambodia and Laos, called French Indochina. Colonized by France in the late 19th century, Japan had occupied the territory in 1940, initially with French cooperation, but later imprisoned the colonists and taken over completely. When Japan surrendered at the end of World War II in August 1945, a power vacuum was created in Vietnam, where revolutionary Marxist Ho Chi Minh wanted to establish an independent republic before the French could return. The heavily armed, though surrendered Japanese army remained in Vietnam, and with no French forces available to disarm and repatriate them, the British stepped in, becoming embroiled in Ho Chi Minh's fight for independence. The seeds of the Vietnam War in the 1960s were sown by two events that occurred in 1945. The first was Supreme Allied Commander General Douglas MacArthur's refusal to permit the British to occupy Vietnam immediately after the Japanese surrender in August 1945. MacArthur wanted to be seen to take the main Japanese surrender aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay in September 1945. The second was the failure of the later British occupation force in Vietnam to completely destroy the Viet Minh before being prematurely withdrawn by the British government. Britain came tantalizingly close to pacifying post-war Vietnam with barely a tenth of the troops later used by the US, only for circumstances beyond their control to prevent their mission, called Operation Masterdom, from succeeding. In September 1945, a British force was sent to French Indochina to disarm and repatriate Japanese troops, ensure civil order, and offer humanitarian assistance to Allied prisoners of war and civilian internees still in Japanese camps. MacArthur's decision meant that what the British found was a Saigon largely under the control of Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh nationalists armed with Japanese weapons. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Communist Viet Minh moved quickly to establish control over Vietnam, arming itself with Japanese
Like
weapons and taking
kids.
over government offices and administration from the Vichy French regime. Indochina fell under the responsibility of Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten's Southeast Asia Command, or SEAC, and it was vital to move British troops into several former Southeast Asian colonies to disarm and repatriate Japanese troops and pave the way for the return of the colonial powers. Unfortunately, the British government could not supply the necessary men and equipment. In Vietnam, Britain launched Operation Masterdom in September 1945. Major General Douglas Gracie's 80th Indian Infantry Brigade occupied Saigon and carefully took over public utilities and administration from the numerically superior Viet Minh. One problem was General Gracie's rearming of French interned by the Japanese. Released French POWs were ill-disciplined and killed both Viet Minh and innocent civilians they suspected of being Viet Minh. This led the Viet Minh to view the British as helping reimpose French colonialism. In turn, they massacred 300 French and Eurasian families. The situation deteriorated rapidly and heavy fighting broke out, but the Communists launched a series of mass assaults against Saigon, forcing British, Indian and Gurkha units to mount defensive battles. In an extraordinary move, Gracie, chronically short of men, ordered that Japanese troops be rearmed and placed under British control. They proved to be excellent, though controversial fighters. Japanese units serving alongside British forces in combat. These battles were the last for the wartime Imperial Japanese Army, which had actually legally ceased to exist in Japan, which had no official army at this time. Another British infantry brigade arrived in October 1945, as well as some French troops, but the Viet Minh assaults were relentless against Saigon and its environs. The British used their jungle warfare and counter-insurgency experience to aggressively patrol and locally defeat Viet Minh forces. A special British-Japanese task force known as Gate Force managed to push the Viet Minh away from Saigon in fierce fighting. A Gurkha mission sent to rescue French hostages gallantly stormed a fort in vicious hand-to-hand fighting. By this stage, the British were on the verge of winning the First Vietnam War. However, in December
Gurkha's secret
1945,
weapon.
fresh French forces began to arrive from Europe. Many of them were former French resistance fighters with no experience of colonial soldiering. Their attitude towards the Vietnamese was harsh and engendered widespread resentment among many ordinary Vietnamese, and of course fueled support for the Viet Minh. Unable to cope, this force rapidly lost ground to the Viet Minh, who recaptured most of the vital Central Highlands region. British warnings to reinforce General Gracie's troops were ignored by London. The British government prioritised Malaya over Vietnam, where Chinese communists were attempting to undermine British rule in another colony recaptured from the Japanese. The government began the withdrawal of British forces from Indochina with disastrous historical consequences. In January 1946, the British won their last major battles against the Viet Minh. The British and Japanese tactically defeated the Viet Minh, forcing them to resort to the first modern unconventional war, marked by ambushes, hit-and-run tactics, and assassinations. If reinforced, aggressive British patrolling by jungle warfare experienced troops would have countered even these threats and restored order in Vietnam. At the end of January 1946, the British handed over command to the French. The last British troops left in May 1946, leaving the French responsible for disarming the Japanese and pacifying the country. In the aftermath of the British withdrawal, thousands of people died as the French rapidly lost control. Ho Chi Minh's failure to secure independence from the French ended in the opening of the Indo-Chinese War, ending in complete French defeat in 1954 and the eventual intervention of the United States and its own defeat in 1975. If the British had been permitted longer in Vietnam and been significantly reinforced, the Viet Minh would have been destroyed, communism finding very little support among ordinary Vietnamese at the time. This era, and the era of allowing the French to return with inferior military units, ultimately led to French defeat and American involvement in Vietnam. For only 40 dead, the British almost managed to stabilize Vietnam. Under British control, over 2,700 Viet Minh had been killed and the organization militarily defeated. This episode of Mark Felton Productions was brought to you by the Great Courses Plus, where you can...
Wow. So what you all did ended up leading to our Vietnam War didn't do. So you guys could have ended it, and you guys kind of refocused on what Malaysia, and then left France to clean it up, and France fumbled the bag. And then we went and I, obviously in American culture there are I wasn't around. My mom was born in the early 60s, so she doesn't remember much of it, although like I have uncles that were in the war. I don't know that they were in Vietnam War though. Um I don't think so. But it's generally thought of as a war that shouldn't have happened. It was a mistake. Um I think American public really turned on their own military for what was going on. They didn't agree with the war. They didn't want to go. Of course, the draft had a lot to do with the public not approving of it because they're taking their sons that didn't want to fight, didn't believe in it, and so yeah, the Vietnam War was a mess. Wish you guys would have finished that. Probably would have changed the course of history for sure. But that's interesting because I didn't know about any of that. I only kind of know the basics and just having watched shows and movies and stuff about that time, of what like the sentiment was and all of it. Um, there was a series, and I think only lasted one season. I can't even remember if it was Cinemax or Showtime, but it was like, what was the name of that show? Um, but it basically took place during that time, but it's a modern day show, obviously. And it was about a guy who had left to go to Vietnam. He got drafted and he went, and like his girlfriend was cheating on him while he was overseas, and he came back, and like just even coming through the airport there were people like throwing stuff at them and yelling at them and protesting. And I think a lot of those soldiers really had a hard time. um I mean, you could kind of see what a little bit of probably what they went through, not only what they dealt with during the war, but like coming back, and there was no appreciation. People hated them for what they were doing over there. I think probably a lot of them might not have made it too long even coming back. Um, I mean, you think about soldiers today, obviously, mm, I think our most recent war was like the Afghanistan and all that stuff, and even where I think a lot of Americans, especially after 9/11 happened, were like, "Yeah, you gotta go do something," and then even those guys that had support came back and they have PTSD and have a hard time even when people are supporting them. So think about those guys during Vietnam coming back and having no support. Um, and they didn't even have a choice. So it's interesting. It is interesting. It does certainly add. It's food for thought. That's for sure. Um, But the Mark Felton video was great. It was short, but it explained it, I think, really well. Um, I definitely have several of his videos saved to watch, so we will do some more from him. But if you guys want to put some more in the comments, I'll absolutely add them to the list if they're not on there already. And if you enjoyed the video, hit like, hit subscribe, share, hype, and have a great day, guys. Thanks for watching with me.